needs. Oh, we're recording. Um, so uh, they don't have any different sleep needs. They all need the same amount of sleep. They also have the same potential to sleep as well. Just because you have a developmental diagnosis doesn't mean that your child has no potential to sleep. Sometimes it just means that we need to take a little bit more care in teaching the skill and maybe peel back the onion a little further to see what's really at the root of some of these sleep problems. Children with ADHD or autism may have greater sensory needs. So that's a factor, and we want to make sure that we are addressing those sensory needs during the day so that they're not erupting right at bedtime and disrupting the sleep pattern. And they may have greater difficulty settling down before sleep is expected, sometimes due to the sensory needs, sometimes due to medications that the child might be on, and sometimes because their self-regulation isn't as developed as maybe a neurotypical child of the same age. Okay, so we might have a 7-year-old who just doesn't have those self-regulatory skills where another 7-year-old may. I usually don't start talking about melatonin. I usually don't start out my presentations this way. But typically when families come to me, this is a big question that they have. And it's usually the first thing that they are worried about or concerned about or have a question about. So I put it at the beginning because I want to sort of take melatonin off the table as a variable. I usually keep it towards the end because after all the information, yeah, people still have questions about it. But it's important to speak about now because the prevalence of use of melatonin for sleep in children, not just children with ADHD, autism, or any other diagnosis, but children in general, the use of melatonin for sleep support since 2020, the 2020 happening, has skyrocketed. It's increased over 200% of usage for sleep in the pediatric population. So I thought it was important to talk about straight away. So what's important to know about melatonin is that it is typically used as a supplement for jet lag and for short-term use. It's also used in the elderly population over the age of 55, because over the age of 55, we stop producing melatonin or we become weak producers. So as a supplement, it's not really intended for long-term use. It's really intended for what we call circadian rhythm correction. So if you have traveled and your circadian rhythm has gotten off, that means that wake sleep rhythm that we're in, and bedtime has to change significantly based on our body clock. If we're traveling, melatonin can be really helpful. If we've had a few days of insomnia for, let's say, the adult population, for short-term use for correction. So that's sort of in its roots why supplementation sort of became a thing. The issue is if we're not low producers of melatonin, or if we were going to produce melatonin and now we put more melatonin on top of it, it can cause night awakenings if we don't actually need it. So how do we know if we need it or not? We'll talk about that in a minute. It is unclear what the correct dosing is. The United States and Canada are the only places where we can get over-the-counter melatonin and dose ourselves. Everywhere else in the world, it's by prescription only. And a physician will say, okay, you need to take 2 milligrams, 3 milligrams, 5 milligrams, something like that. It comes by prescription. And it's typically by prescription only for the elderly over 55. Although some of you might be 55 in here and you don't feel elderly, but that's what it's considered. Okay. So it's really unclear with the over-the-counter melatonin what the correct dosing is. We also know that the dosing increases over time, whatever that is. So if you start with 1 milligram, in a few months, you might need 2 milligrams and 3 milligrams and 5 milligrams. And I have seen teenagers who are on 15, 20 milligrams of melatonin because it's increased over time. Sometimes that's an indication that we didn't really need it in the first place and that our own melatonin production has adjusted to accommodate now the supplementation. Limited research. So we really don't know any of the long-term effects. This is what families usually ask me is it bad to be on for a long time? Well, the truth is we don't know. We have no idea. We don't have any really long-term information about synthetic supplemental melatonin exposure. So there's really no clear answer to that. What's important to know is that it typically isn't the core problem with our children. So when we are treating children with sleep problems, we don't need to walk in saying, well, this is probably a melatonin production problem, because typically it's not. Okay, so important things to know about melatonin. Okay, that's just the preamble. So why isn't the child sleeping? If it's not melatonin, if it's not melatonin production, if that's not typically the core problem, why isn't my child sleeping? Why isn't our client sleeping? So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about it in 3 interesting sections. Okay. First, we're going to talk about schedules. So mistimed bedtimes, wrong bedtime for the wrong age, inconsistent morning wake up times. Okay, accidental daytime sleep. If we have a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old who's falling asleep in the car or who's falling asleep in school and stealing that daytime sleep. I'm going to talk about that. So we're talking about schedules first and talk about how to figure out what is the right schedule or the right amount of time of sleep your child needs or our client needs in a 24-hour period. Bedtime routines that steal sleep. Not all bedtime routines are created equal. Sometimes we accidentally have activities embedded in our bedtime routines that are actually sabotaging sleep, that are actually stealing from a child's ability to fall asleep fast and to stay asleep all night. And then we'll talk about sleep dependencies that change after sleep onset. So that's another reason children often don't sleep through the night, right? In air quotes, is they fall asleep, let's say with parent helping them, and then the parent leaves after the child falls asleep. And then we have all these night wakings because the child now needs parent to come back in, or it could be a bottle of milk or something like that. So we will talk about sleep dependencies, and we'll also talk about how to make these changes and how to make them in as simple a way as possible. So let's talk about schedules. We're going to talk about schedules sort of across the lifespan. So sleep is constantly changing. From birth until we are 99 years old, sleep is always changing. Sometimes we get into certain phases of life where sleep stabilizes for some time, for even a couple of years. In the first 5 years of life, the most changes happen. And if we're not ebbing and flowing, if we're not correcting schedules, if we're not making adjustments along the way, we will fall into unsustainable sleep patterns. It's the idea that if you have a 12-year-old, you're not going to put them to bed at 7:30, just like you're probably not going to put your 3-year-old to bed at midnight, right? So how do we change schedules across the lifespan with sleep always changing and not really ever knowing exactly the moment sleep is going to change, right? How do we predict when sleep is going to change, what that's going to look like, and how do we make those adjustments? So let's talk about waking windows. So a waking window is the amount of time the body absolutely needs to be awake before it's able to accept sleep again. The waking window expands over time. It also changes around whether if there's naps or no naps. So it really determines whether there's going to be a nap or not and how many hours of awake time they need before they're going to be able to sleep again. So it's important to know that the waking window expands across the lifespan, and it determines whether there is going to be a nap or no nap after about 2.5, 3 years old. So why does the waking window matter? We're going to go into this in just a second, but it really determines bedtime. What time is bedtime supposed to be for my child? If we offer a waking window that is too short, we're going to end up with sleep resistance. So if we put a child to sleep too soon, right? If we put that 12-year-old to sleep at 7:30, it's going to be mutiny. I can tell you that right now. So we end up with sleep resistance, right? We end up with the child coming out of bed 100 times. I need another drink. I want more snuggles. I need another hug. Can I please watch more TV? Whatever that might be. So we see sleep resistance if the waking window we've offered is too short. And if it's too wide, we run the risk of having a child who gets overtired. And the interesting thing about that is that overtired looks like not tired at all. It looks like running around. It looks like jumping on the bed. It looks like hyperactivity sometimes. So overtired can look like hyperactive. So if we look here at our little pyramid, we can see, I'm on my view, I'm covering that one a little bit, but around 1 year, the waking window is about 5 hours. What does that mean? That means from the time they wake up in the morning, their body is going to need to be awake about 5 hours before it's going to be able to nap. They can only go 5 hours too. So if you have a 1-year-old who's going 6-7 hours, it's possible that they're getting overtired, and that's going to cause problems too. So there'll be 5 hours in between morning wake up and nap, and then they'll nap for a little while, and then another 5 hours from the time they wake up from their nap until the time we offer bedtime. So in our younger population, let's say in between 1 and 2 years, which is a very popular age range for ABA, we're getting kids around 18, 20 months, something like that. So between the age of 1 and 2, if the child is napping until 4 or 5 o'clock, they're probably not going to be ready for bedtime until 9 o'clock, or maybe even a little bit later. So sometimes families will come to us and say, oh my gosh, my 1-year-old doesn't go to sleep until 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. But when you ask about naps, well, they're sleeping until 4 or 5 o'clock. So this is why we're getting this late bedtime. This is why our 1-year-old isn't falling asleep at 7:30. It's because they're napping until 4 or 5. So asking the question about morning wake up time and about naps, and taking into consideration how old the child is, we as the clinicians can be really supportive to families in helping them understand some realistic expectations and develop some realistic expectations for their child's sleep. No, your 1-year-old is not going to sleep at 7:30 if they're napping until 5, or if they're napping until 4, or if they're waking up at 9 or 10 in the morning. Right. And then that's why they're not napping until 4 or 5, which is why they're not falling asleep until 9 or 10. Okay. So this is important information because the waking window really drives the entire wake sleep rhythm. And as you see, the amount of time the body is able to sustain wakefulness expands over time, as we were talking about before. So as they get closer to 2 years old, that waking window expands to about 6 hours. Right. So now we're going to have 6 hours between morning wake up and nap. So we have to shift that nap around. So nap isn't always going to be at 11:30. Nap is going to be at 12, and then maybe 12:30. And then by the time they're maybe 2 years old or so, it might be around 1 o'clock, 12:30, 1 o'clock. So naps are going to shift as well. Then depending on how long that 2-year-old or that 3-year-old sleeps is going to drive what time bedtime is. So this is important because it's going to give us some realistic expectations for bedtime. So we're going to kind of tick the box on, ooh, maybe I was putting my child to sleep too soon, or ooh, maybe I was putting my child to sleep a little bit too late. Okay, and this is, as clinicians, as practitioners, this is how we can be helpful for families. So if you look at this, around 3 years old, the nap drops. So that waking window is between 6 and 12 hours. So it's going to be 6 hours if they're still napping. If they're not napping anymore, it's going to be 12 hours. So how does that play out in our 3-year-old population? That's going to look like on days when your child gets a nap, they might not go to sleep until 9:30 or 10 o'clock. But on the days they don't nap, they may go to sleep as early as 6:30 or 7 o'clock. They're waking up pretty consistently around 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. If they nap, bedtime's going to be super late. If they don't nap, bedtime's going to be really early. Around 3 years old, it gets a little confusing because some days they'll nap and some days they won't. So we have to be able to be flexible with our bedtimes and our sleep expectations in that 3-year-old population, because some days it's going to look different than others. Now, as we get closer to school age, right, as we get closer to that kindergarten or early, like early tween, 4th, 5th grade, something like that, We go way big, right? Our child can be awake for, 14, 15 hours. They only need 9 or 10 hours of sleep at night, and it's consolidated. So you can see if we have a 7 or an 8-year-old who's napping, how that's going to be a huge confounding variable to bedtime. Right? If we have a 12-year-old who's taking a nap during the day, yeah, they're not going to go to sleep until 2 or 3 in the morning. So sometimes we get families of older children who come to us worried that their child isn't falling asleep until 2 a.m. But then when we really ask the questions about daytime sleep, we find that they are sneaking some sleep on the couch or on the bus on the way home, or even on on the beanbag at school or something like that. We need to ask teachers those questions as well. So waking windows are really important. They really drive the entire schedule. So we need to know some of these age-related averages so that we can support families with realistic sleep expectations. Yep, here we go. All right, so the good news is, is that sometimes sleep problems just come down to schedule adjustments. Sometimes we can fix the whole system just by having some new expectations for the schedule and more realistic expectations for what time bedtime is going to be, what time nap is going to be, whether the child needs a nap or not, if we should be pushing through the day and offering them a cold glass of water and some outside time instead of falling asleep on the couch at 4 o'clock, right? Watching some TV. So we're going to eliminate some daytime sleep or limit naps, just depending on the age of the client, of the consumer. We're going to make sure that we wake the child at the same time every day. And by the way, this is important information for us as well. Us adults. Sleeping in is not really making up any sleep. We don't make up sleep. We can sleep more to feel more rested, but we're never going to actually recover the sleep that we have lost. So waking up at the same time every morning is going to ensure that we have a pretty consistent bedtime every night. So some families will say, oh, I never know when they're going to get tired. If we really look back at the early morning and see what the morning looks like, sometimes we can hit that nail on the head and say, oh, well, sometimes they sleep until 9, sometimes they wake up at 7. On the weekends, they sleep until 10, but every day during school, they need to be up by 6:30. We're going to have this variability, and this is where we are going to see some variability with bedtimes as well. We always want to offer sleep at the end of a waking window, or even like a little bit later if we're having trouble with actually falling asleep. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Sometimes putting them to bed 15 or 20 minutes later could be the correction that we need. And we can eliminate what's known as sleep latency, that coming out of bed, that not able to fall asleep, or it takes my child an hour to fall asleep, Emily. Yes, well, maybe that's because we're putting them to bed an hour too soon. So sleep latency could be eliminated as bedtimes become more predictable. Okay. So there's the good news, is that sometimes it's as easy as just changing a schedule. Okay. Let's talk about some bedtime do's and don'ts. We're going to talk about the bedtime routine, what that should look like, where we goof, where we make some mistakes, and what we can be doing better with. So bedtime routines in general help sleep. They help us fall asleep quickly. For adults too, guys. If you're struggling with your own sleep, you're going to find some takeaway goodies here too. So bedtime routines help us fall asleep quickly, help us fall asleep calm, help us fall asleep more independently. So sometimes if we have a parent who needs to fall asleep with a child to help them fall asleep, we can actually achieve better sleep if we have a better, more independent sleep if we have a better bedtime routine. Okay. Fall asleep without resistance. Right now we're talking about good timing, and now we're talking about having the right activities leading up to sleep can result in less resistance to bedtime. Falling asleep at a more predictable time. Again, that's that sleep latency. So we're not kind of chasing the child around for an hour and a half before they actually fall asleep. And the icing on the cake is that we're going to offer caregivers some freedom at night. Right? If the child is falling asleep at a more predictable time, if they are falling asleep rather quickly, and we can get families out of the bedroom faster, out of that falling asleep association, we can really have caregivers having some self-care at night, actually taking time for themselves to watch a little TV, to eat dinner in peace, something like that. So that's sort of the icing on the cake to a solid bedtime routine. So what is the recipe for a really good bedtime routine? So the correct bedtime first and foremost, right? So that's going to be driven by a consistent morning wake up time or a consistent nap wake up time. Calming activities that encourage sleep, we'll talk about those, and in the same order every night. So some people get a little, what do you mean the same order every night? It doesn't have to be the same activity. So if we put quiet play, let's say, into the bedtime routine, it doesn't have to be the exact same activities. We just know that quiet play is quiet play. It can be puzzles. It can be a board game. It can be building. It can be trains. It can be Lego, something like that. It doesn't have to be the same activity every night. But if we put quiet play in there, we know that means just some downtime. So let's talk about screen time. So sometimes screen time is part of the bedtime routine. Now, the thing with screen time is it is what we consider bidirectionally reinforcing, which means families are really reinforced by having their child be on some screen time because it offers them some personal time. It offers families some quiet time or the ability to attend to siblings, right? So it's reinforcing for caregivers to have their child, usually with a developmental disability, to be on a screen, right? So it's reinforcing. And then it's also reinforcing for the child, obviously. So there's this bidirectionality to screen time as a part of bedtime. The problem with that is that screen time is a sleep stealer, not because, it escalates our children too much or because it triggers their sensory needs or, it races their brain. That's not why. It's because of the actual light that is coming off of the device. So all of our smart screens, all of them are LED light. An LED light, it has the same wavelength as the rays of the sun. Okay. So basically, when we look up close at our devices, we're getting concentrated blue light into our eyes, and the cones of our eyes register it as daytime. So when we are viewing screen time late at night, when sleep should be happening, our brains aren't producing melatonin. And so we're not going to be calm and quiet. We're not going to be ready for sleep because our melatonin is being stopped. So this comes back to why a lot of families end up on melatonin for their children. We're viewing screen time so late into the night that it seems like your child can't fall asleep. So we end up offering supplemental melatonin. And so it could work, yeah, but really the melatonin production wasn't the problem. It was being stopped by the screen time. So all LED screens, computers, tablets, phones use LED technology now. They're all LED lights. It's hard to find any other kind of lighting other than LED on our smart screens. And it's important to know that when we are looking at our screens, that's why we might be seeing delayed sleep onset or sleep latency in our children. It really is a profound variable in the ability to fall asleep. A lot of children will view their screens all the way until they fall asleep. And so then families say, they don't fall asleep until midnight. They don't fall asleep until 1 a.m. Oh, are they falling asleep watching their tablet or a phone? If the answer is yes, what's happened is, see, melatonin just sounds the fire. It just gives the signal for all the other sleep hormones. It's not our only sleep hormone. We have a lot of sleep hormones. So if our body doesn't get that melatonin, if our brain doesn't get that melatonin signal, all that means is that sleep will happen later. It will still happen, but it's just going to end up being an hour, 2 hours, or 3 hours past the time that the body needed to fall asleep. So we look back at those waking windows. Well, the child should have been asleep probably at 8, but here they are still up until 10. And they finally crash at 10 because then the other sleep hormones go, hey, knock, knock. You forgot to fire the gun. You forgot to, set off the signal that sleep is coming. You forgot to trigger our response. So melatonin really signals the other hormones to get in gear. And in the absence of it, we just see a much later bedtime. So we have to get screen time out of the bedtime routine, and I'm going to talk about how to do that, okay? The second very common sleep stealer is jumping and gross motor activity. Now we have a lot of clients with some big sensory needs. So they jump and they crash and they run around, and a lot of families say they just don't stop moving. Even when they're sitting still, they're sweating because they just have this engine that just won't shut off. They just have an engine that is just going, going, going. So what a lot of families are told is to get the wiggles out before bed. But unfortunately, that ends up shooting sleep right in the foot. Jumping up and down. So for two reasons. One, we have this jumping up and down sensory need. So we have trampolines, right? Or yoga balls or they're jumping on the couch or they're jumping on their bed, right? And we say they're getting their wiggles out. But what's actually happening is this kind of sensory input is alerting to the brain. We're actually waking the brain up when we do this. Now that's great for ABA sessions, right? If we have a little jumping on the trampoline, you're going to notice they come off, they might have more language or more attention, which is great for ABA. It's great for school. It's great for learning, but it sabotages sleep, right? Because we don't want the brain to be super stimulated and awake at bedtime. The other variable is that it increases the core body temperature. And when we have a hot core body temperature, we see delayed sleep onset. Our body temperature needs to be 2 to 3 degrees cooler at sleep onset in order for fast or for rapid sleep onset to decrease that sleep latency. So jumping, crashing, getting the wiggles out is actually killing sleep. It encourages focus and attention. It raises the core body temperature. It is alerting. And it delays sleep onset, causes late bedtimes, okay? So we want to get any kind of gross motor activities, any kind of jumping, crashing, running out of the bedtime routine. So I know if you're a parent, you're gonna be sitting on the other side of this screen going, well, what do I do? If we don't do screen time and we don't do jumping and running around, well, what do we do for bedtime? So let's talk about that. So let's talk about that transition to sleep. Sometimes we forget that even for ourselves as children, sleep is aversive, right? When we were kids, it was, okay, turn off the TV and go to bed, or you're going to go to bed without dinner, or go to your room and go to sleep. You know, you've lost your privileges, just go to bed, right? So when we were young, we sometimes experienced this aversive nature to sleep. And if you really think about sleep at the end of the day, it is the only time during the day, really, when the child is alone, in the dark, left with their thoughts, and with no stimulation. Right? So we have children with sensory needs and who always need to be engaged in something. We can see where we start seeing those bedtime shenanigans, right? Where we start seeing this resistance to bedtime in general. So assuming that sleep is the least preferred activity on the bedtime routine list, we're going to put the order of our activities in a hierarchy, right? We're going to start with the most preferred activity, the furthest away from when sleep is expected. And we're going to slowly transition from activity to activity to activity until we achieve this calming experience for the children. And we end with that least preferred activity. And we're not going right from screen time to bed. We're not going right from playtime to bed. Right? We're going to put things in order. So I encourage you to even just make a list, even as we're just sitting here thinking about our clients or thinking about our own children, of what other activities excite them. Well, I shouldn't say excite them, engage them, correct myself, that can eat up some time in the bedtime routine. Now, when it comes to screen time, a lot of families will say, well, they don't like to do anything except watch TV, or they don't like to do anything except be on their tablet. That's not 100% true. That's really our perception, because what is coming off of the screen is so highly preferred. It might seem like they have no other activities that they really enjoy. But when we really remove that screen time and don't offer it as an option for a duration of time, we will see that the children actually have quite a few activities that they really enjoy doing. And it can be anything. It can be, like I mentioned before, it can be trains, it can be building, it can be cars, puzzles, put in, sorting, matching. It can be kinetic sand, it can be drawing, it can be Play-Doh. It could be anything. Fine motor tasks are great for bedtime routine because you can't run around and do a fine motor activity at the same time. So especially for those kids that have really hot engines who really have trouble settling down, having something like a put-in is going to contain their body even just for a few minutes, okay? So we're going to start with screen time and then maybe go to the next highest preferred thing, which might be like kinetic sand. And then the next highly preferred thing which might be building your puzzles. And then the next preferred thing. Now let's talk about bath and shower, because a bath or a shower, most kids love, and it eats up a whole lot of time during the bedtime routine. There's nothing wrong with popping your kid in the bath for a half an hour during the bedtime routine and eating up a good chunk of time. First of all, baths and showers are relaxing. Second of all, when you get out of the hot bath or shower or the warm bath or shower, you know how your skin gets all prickly and red? That's actually the blood rushing to the surface, which is actually cooling your core temperature. So a warm bath or a hot shower before bed is the best thing to start that calming process. So I love a long bedtime bath or a long bedtime shower because it eats up a lot of time and it cools the core body temperature. So it ticks 2 boxes during the bedtime routine. There is no shame in the half-hour bath time, no shame in it. Okay. And some kids need to go right from that bath right into bed and not even go back onto that screen time. And like a pro tip, if you will, is the screens just kind of go away after the bath time. You can't be on a screen and be in the bath. It's incompatible. So for our purposes, it's the perfect time to just put the screens away and to not have them be an option once your child gets out of the bath or shower. You go right to pajamas, maybe some calming sensory, some massage, some essential oils, a good rub with some lotions or something like that. And then lights out. So we're going to scaffold the bedtime routine to go from sort of the most exciting to the least exciting so that we're not fostering bedtime resistance by terminating preferred activities to go do a non-preferred activity, which is sleep. Okay, so that's a little bit about the bedtime routines. Let's talk real quick about medications, because they are a confounding variable for a lot of kids, especially if we have children who are on stimulants, whether that's for your ADHD or for your autism, or even if it's just asthma and allergies. Sometimes the medications that children are on are stimulants and will steal from sleep. And there are certain factors that we can control when it comes to medications, and some that we can't. So we just need to work with our physicians. So we want to collaborate with physicians about the timing of medications. If we are on an ADHD medication, let's say we are on a stimulant, to make sure that we're timing it at a time when it's going to have worn out of the body system by the time sleep comes. Okay. If you have a child who's on a booster in the afternoon, making sure that booster is also a short-term thing, if possible. Now, of course, we have situations where they just can't not be on their stimulants in the afternoon and they need a bigger dose, something like that. In which case, we want to work with the physicians on maybe seeing if there is an alternative that's maybe not a stimulant that could achieve the same goal. We need to understand those side effects so that we're not trying to put the square peg in the round hole. If we have a child who's on a medication that's known to be a stimulant, we need to predict that there might be some problems with sleep, and then work backwards from there. See if timing adjustments are possible, see if dosing adjustments are possible, see if any of those changes are possible so that we can foster better falling asleep. Some medications do cause disruptions overnight. We need to know about those. Some medications wear off if they're intended for sleep. If we're on a sleep medication, if we have a client who's on an Ambien or a Lunesta or a Clonidine or anything like that, sometimes those wear off and then we're left with a huge waking in the middle of the night, 2 or 3 hours, and then they go back to sleep at 5 a.m. and that makes mornings real tough. So we need to just be aware of timing of medications and if they wear off, if they're intended for sleep, and not making any changes to those medications without medical consent. We do need to be aware of these side effects before we move into any sleep change programs. But really working with our physician to see if there's any wiggle room for some changes. Okay. So sleep dependencies. What is a sleep dependency? A sleep dependency is the thing a child requires, I'll put that in air quote, or they have been accustomed to in order to fall asleep. So that could be sucking on a bottle to fall asleep, like nourishing to sleep. It could be having a caregiver lay down with the child to help them fall asleep. It could be watching the tablet to fall asleep. Any of these are considered sleep dependencies where if you try to change it, the child exhibits a behavior. Okay, that's how we know it's a dependency. When we change it, or we're afraid to change it because we're afraid of the behavioral outcome. That's how you know you have a sleep dependency. Or if we get the child to sleep with that sleep dependency, if they're seeking it throughout the night. Okay, so let's talk about how sleep works. Sometimes just understanding how sleep works overnight can help us have a little more awareness of what's going on with your children when we have middle of the night wakings. So one last little assumption is that 0 people fall asleep at bedtime and wake up in the morning. Let's wrap our heads around that for a second. 0 people fall asleep at bedtime and wake up in the morning. Okay. Sleep is not a rainbow arc. Sleep looks like this: up, down, up, down, up, down all night long. We have light phases of sleep up here where our dreams happen and awakings naturally occur. We wake up all night long. And then our deep sleep at the bottom, where really nothing's happening. We are comatose. We are not aware of what's happening around us. We are just in a deep sleep, pretty much not moving. Okay. Light sleep is where we get all the shenanigans. Okay. When a child falls asleep with a sleep dependency at sleep onset, they dip into deep sleep. But then when they crest into light sleep, they're expecting the environment to look exactly the same as it did at bedtime. So if you have a child who is falling asleep on the bottle, you're going to notice that they need a bottle multiple times per night. If you have a child who has a caregiver laying down with them, you're going to notice that they come out of bed multiple times per night looking for that caregiver. Anything that changes after sleep onset is a recipe for multiple night awakenings. So in order to get more contiguous night sleep, so it looks like we're falling asleep at bedtime and waking up in the morning, so we have that kind of appearance of sustained sleep, we have to fix what's happening at bedtime with those sleep dependencies. As long as the brain falls asleep with some kind of support, even if it's music, it could be music and then the music turns off and then the child needs, someone to come in and lay with them or turn the music back on or do something to help them fall asleep later in the night. It's because that music was on and then it turned off. Could be a light. It could be a light, mommy, keep the light on, keep the light on. And then being the good caregivers that we are, after the child falls asleep, we go and we shut the lights off. And then we wonder why they're coming out of bed 100 times a night and they need that light back on. So we need to understand that wakings naturally occur during light phases of sleep, and we cycle through multiple light phases of sleep every night. Throughout the night, we're cycling through lots of light phases of sleep. So we're having lots of awakenings. Now, for a child who seems to sleep through the night, where it seems like they fall asleep at bedtime and wake up in the morning, it just means that they have sustainable sleep dependencies. It means that they can control them on their own, right? So that child who sleeps through the night has dependencies that they can manage throughout the night. They have a lovey or they have a pacifier that they can, find and recover throughout the night, or, they have their blankie or something like that. They have something that's with them all night long that never changes. Okay, so assisting sleep steals sleep. The brain craves consistency. How we fall asleep determines how we fall asleep, right? How we fall asleep at bedtime determines how we fall asleep the rest of the night. Now, this can go for adults too. If you're listening to podcasts as you fall asleep, if you need music to fall asleep in your ears, or you're listening to like some kind of talk radio or something like that, you're going to notice that around 2 a.m., you're going to wake up and you're going to need to refresh your podcast or turn your music back on or something like that to help you get back to sleep. That's your own little sleep dependency. So any changes made after sleep onset will result in night awakenings. And it matters because it determines, those sleep dependencies determine whether or not your child is going to sustain their sleep throughout the night, whether there's going to be night awakenings or not. So what do we do about it? We have about 7 minutes to blow through this. So now we're talking about sleep training. So in the traditional sense of sleep training, we would say something like, okay, well, just don't lay down with the child or don't give them the bottle, and they're going to have big behavior. So just walk them back to sleep 100 times. But that's not really sustainable when we're talking about the autism or ADHD population, where we know that behaviors can get really messy. Behaviors look really gross. So it's easy for me to be like, oh, just, put them to bed without you and just walk them back 100 times. Well, I don't have to be there when they're kicking and screaming and banging their heads. Okay. So that's not fair for someone to say, just walk them back to sleep 100 times. Right. Especially if you have a behavioral profile that's more aggressive. Okay. So I learned this from Dr. Gregory Hanley. This is not mine, but it's basically intermittent reinforcement of desired behavior. So this is quiet-based visiting. This is a method I really like for older kids or children who have more aggressive behavioral profiles. And here's how it works. I'm going to try and blow through this. I have a quick video at the end that really explains it well. So I'm going to kind of bust through this just a little bit. The first thing we're going to do, and feel free to screenshot any of this, by the way, is establish a consistent bedtime and bedtime routine. We talked about all that. So before we make any changes to how the child falls asleep, before we pull mom and dad out of the falling asleep equation, we're going to make sure all those other I's are dotted and T's are crossed that we just talked about. All those other things need to be in place before we move into any kind of sleep change program. Make sure everything is stable for a week. Sometimes that means having a caregiver actually sleep with the child for the whole night, just to get their circadian rhythm on board, right? We have done that, and it seems like we're working in reverse, but actually, if we're going to stabilize the entire wake sleep rhythm, and we're going to have a perfectly timed bedtime and a really good calming bedtime routine, to get the child to sleep through the night just for a week, we might have to have a caregiver sleep in the same room with the child before we pull them back out. Okay. So keep that in mind as one alternative. So figuring out what time the child actually falls asleep, because lights out might not be the same time as fall asleep time. We need to know when they fall asleep. And caregivers during this time when we're just getting things stable, are going to continue assisting sleep in the short term. We are going to work with scheduled check-ins. I call it be right back. We just say, hey, I'm going to be right back. And then we come back in, right? We're going to teach some healthy separation here. Now, we have to master this during the day first, right? This is intermittent reinforcement of desired behaviors. When sleep is not expected, okay, we're not going to just walk in at bedtime and say, hey, buddy, I'm not sleeping with you tonight. Take care. I'll be back in a second. No, they're going to come follow you. So we don't want to do it right then and there. We want to teach this during the day. So your ABA team can be really helpful in teaching healthy separation and waiting when we say, I'll be right back. And it's followed by a short duration. You'll see 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, short duration of a wait. And then the caregiver comes back and provides that reinforcement. Hey, you waited. Oh, good job. Pat on the back, whatever it is. So we're going to teach this during the day so that we can take this mastered skill and now plug and play into bedtime, because we have all the other things in place. So now all we need to do is change how the child falls asleep. I know I'm making it sound so much more simple than it really is. So we're going to practice this everywhere. We're going to practice it in the common spaces of the home, in the child's room. A lot of healthy play in the bedroom is good. On the child's bed is even better. If we can have some really awesome playtime on the bed and then say, hey, hang on, I'll be right back. So during the day, they're learning that when you say you'll be right back, you're actually going to be right back very quickly. A lot of this has to do with rebuilding trust, because we try to trick our kids all the time. We put them to sleep and we say, oh, buddy, you're so tired. I'll be right back. I'm just going to go check on something. And then we leave for 10 minutes. And then after a second, they're back outside because they don't trust that you're actually going to come back. So we need to do it really quickly. We're going to do it during the bedtime routine is really crucial. So now they're pairing that evening experience, that wind down experience, with some flow of caregivers coming and going back and forth, or maybe putting the bottle earlier in the bedtime routine, something like that. Okay, this is mostly for when caregivers are the situation, when the caregiver is laying down with the child to help them fall asleep. This is what this strategy is really for. I want to leave time for questions. I'm 2 minutes. Okay, so the caregivers will say something on night one when we're ready to go. Don't worry, I have a video. The video is 3 minutes, so you might run like 1 minute into Q&A. Caregivers will say something like, I've got a few things to do at bedtime, buddy, but I'll keep checking in on you until you're asleep. Now, you've already practiced this. We've already practiced coming back real quickly, 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. So you're going to do the same thing at bedtime. No more than 3 seconds at first. Don't get tricky and say, oh, they waited 5 minutes during the day, so we're going to start with 5 minutes at night. Have to start right at the very, very, very beginning of bedtime. Every time you come back in, gently touch. Okay, let's watch this real short video, 3 minutes, and then we're going to do Q&A.
Emily, I don't know if we're supposed to be hearing any sound, but there's no sound. Ah, perfect.
All right, let's toggle away. Here's my contact information. If you need any support or have any questions, you can get me Emily@readysetsleep.com, or my website is just readysetsleep.com. I'm over on Instagram @readysetsleep with a little underscore. I put informational videos and posts on there as well. So let's go ahead. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let's take these questions.
That was super helpful. I feel like I learned a lot. Let's see.
So much.
So much I did, especially with those check-ins. It's such a great idea. All right, so we do have one, well, let's see, 2 questions from one parent with 2 different kiddos. One is age 12. How can we help children who appear to have some challenges that result in frequent bedwetting at night? For example, our child will stay asleep in wet, cold clothing and wet soil bedding without waking up. Is that something that you've come across, or any suggestions with a child that's not waking up even though they're wet at night?
Yeah, it's hard to change something that happens when we're in a deep sleep. I would be curious about medications, if there's any medications at play where they're getting into such a deep sleep that they're not aware of that they've soiled themselves. Sometimes that happens with sedatives. We sometimes see that. So I would wonder if there's any changes we can make there. Um, Also, fluid intake, just making sure that the child is drinking plenty throughout the day. Sometimes if we only get a lot of intake at night, it does result in bedwetting. In theory, the brain shuts off those systems at bedtime, or once we dip into deep sleep. So I would sort of wonder what else is going on, whether there was something medical like bladder weakness or something like that. My guess is that they are just, if they're deep in a sleep and not waking up from it, I mean, that's kind of a good thing because they're able to sleep, although we obviously don't want them sleeping in a soiled bed. That's not going to be healthy long term as well. So uh I would be curious as to any kind of medications or why they're sleeping so deeply, and then on the other side saying, well, why isn't the bladder control, um there are there medications that are affecting the bladder control too, or is it just a skill, I'm sorry, not a skill, a system that we just need to support a little bit more during the day. If the child is getting fluids throughout the day, we can then say, okay, we're going to cut them off by 7 o'clock, 7:30, so that the bladder is relatively empty when they go to sleep. But it's important to front load a lot of those fluids in the morning and throughout the day so that we're not depriving the body of any fluid intake, late into the evening, something like that.
That's a
I would
great
just have more questions. I would have more questions about that.
suggestion. So thinking about medication, but also kind of recognizing that we might be able to get in all of our fluids during the day so that our bladder isn't full at nighttime.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the second one, age 17, older adolescent experiences frequent insomnia. Shuns taking any herbal supplements or Benadryl because she'll feel foggy in the morning. Any other suggestions for insomnia?
So I would wonder about screen time. I would wonder if there's screen time at play, which is in the older kids, typically what I see is screen time usage late into the evening, late into the night, and then that stops the melatonin and that creates insomnia. I would wonder about daytime sleep. I would also wonder about morning wake up. Is morning wake up a little too late, and then they're not desiring bedtime? At 17, bedtime wouldn't be until 11 o'clock anyway, just because of how melatonin produces in adolescence. So I would wonder what that insomnia means. Are they trying to go for bedtime at 10, but maybe the child's not really tired until 11, which would be considered normal? Or is it not until 2 or 3 in the morning? Then I would wonder about screen time, things like that. Is there any caffeine at play? Is there any even chocolate, something like that that has caffeine and sugar late at night? Or is there some anxiety at play, which we also see in the teenage population, is real anxiety when it comes down to school expectations, if they are if they are in some kind of if they're in high school looking towards, college or whatever, but also just, in the autism population, we see a lot of internal anxiety as well. Just, worries about the next day, social things, anything like that, can also cause insomnia as well. In which case, a good bedtime routine, something that's really calming. If the child reads, that would be a great thing to do, not on a tablet, just reading a book. If developmentally they're not readers, then we can do something like building kinetic sand, something a little bit more basic leading up to bedtime. or parents could read to the child, just depending on where they are developmentally, what their skills look like. But there's a lot of things that go into insomnia that are controllable, like things in the environment, like screen time and bedtime routines and bedtime expectations. What time are we offering sleep versus what time are they actually falling asleep? And then there's things that we really can't control from the ABA behavior side, which is that anxiety, which you would maybe want to talk to a physician about if you think it is a true anxiety.
Awesome. Well, we do have some other questions, but we do also need to get to the polls